thank you again so much for being willing to talk with us and provide your insight and thoughts on the topic of Gen Z and activism. To start, could you please talk a little bit about yourself so we can know more about you?
Sure. My name is Gabriel Namias. I am a PhD candidate in political science at MIT, where my research focuses on political recruitment and how people who care deeply about politics try or don't try to get others to participate around those issues. I work on that in the United States and South Africa. Previous to starting my graduate program, I worked with a civic organization in South Africa called Equal Education, which mobilized working class students to advocate for education equality and the improvement in the conditions of their learning, and that really shaped the kind of work I do, which is focusing on how people become owners of the change in their own lives.
That's great. So sort of jumping off of what you study, how do you think that Gen Z has been more involved in like taking ownership of what they see as being problems in the world today compared to previous generations? As a member of Gen Z myself, I definitely noticed that it's an important part of what we do, like in trying to be participating in different spheres and trying to advocate for change in different ways. So do you agree with that, or do you think it's more different or similar to previous generations?
I think Gen Z has come of age during a national crisis, right? Both COVID and, without putting it too far, the previous president were social events to some degree. They were health events. COVID was a health event, but they were also very political events, right? It caused everyone to become aware of how important government is to very tangible aspects of their lives, right? As a result, I think Gen Z coming of age during this crisis was forced to reckon with politics in their lives and engaged more. We can see over time, 2008 was the last time youth were mobilized to vote to a greater degree than they normally do, and that was during the 2008 economic crisis, right? These crises really bring people into politics and challenge our ideas of what is possible or what change we need. If we look at the 2020 election, people under 30 were 8 points more likely to vote than they were in 2016, right? So that's a huge boom. But we saw similar booms in other generations. They were smaller, in large part because young people tend to have more ground to gain because young people tend to vote less. But we saw increases of around 4 percentage points. So that is remarkable, right? And it does make this generation different. I don't think it makes this generation different than any historical generation, but it does make them does mean that they are reckoning with the world in their specific way, and the way that's manifesting is different because the way that we communicate is different. The way we organize ourselves in our lives is different. The kinds of platforms that we have, like historically, 18th century was coffee shops where people had the conversations that sparked revolutions. Now it's chat rooms. That doesn't. I don't think the venue is as important as the conversation, and I think the conversations are roughly the same. In the fact that there are people who are imagining a world different. Now, the world that people imagined in the 18th century and the world that people imagine today is obviously quite different.
Yeah. And you touched on like the different platforms and social media, the internet, and that was my next question. And how do you think, you already touched on this a bit, but how do you think it affects organizing and activism today? Do you think it's more of a positive effect or a negative effect? You know, I think of Slacktivism, how people will post like a picture of showing support, but then nothing really gets done or change doesn't really happen just because you posted a picture.
Yeah, so the critique of Slacktivism, I take the critique very seriously, because I do think a lot of people do engage in very shallow ways in politics.
Mm-hmm.
I think where the critique might be overstated is considering this a unique phenomenon. So if one watches movies from the 70s, they're the East Coast elite. They existed then, and they're at their cocktail parties talking about these changes they want to see. In the South they have these racial problems, right? They'll like talk about it and they won't do anything about it. And the fact that people are doing those kinds of like describing problems without engaging with them online rather than in person or in some other venue, I don't necessarily think that shift of the location means that there's a shift in the underlying behavior. The things that I do think are really exciting about online platforms is people can find each other in a way they couldn't before. They can create spaces. So in the labor movement, for example, Reddit and Facebook groups are really important for people who work in places like Starbucks, where there's 6 or 7 employees that have limited information, but on Reddit there are hundreds and hundreds of employees around the country, and they can share information about what management is doing and learn from each other. So I think there is a lot to be gained. I also think there is an element that we should be concerned about, which is that abundant social science research shows that the way that you persuade people is really like kind of face-to-face interactions. And the kinds of interactions you can have online are just not particularly persuasive. They're not the kinds of interactions that often will, at least immediately, change somebody's mind. While we have like research on deep canvassing that you can have if a transgender person shows up at somebody's door and has a 15-minute conversation with them, that can lastingly change that person's perspective on transgender rights. While we don't see similar findings from Facebook engagement. So I think there is a reasonable concern that the ability of people to connect with people who share their opinions and the shallowness that these platforms facilitate may further distance the people that they need to get on their side if they want to win. I think a really great book on this has nothing to do with it predates social media, which is How We Lost the ERA, or how the Equal Rights Amendment, by Jane Mansbridge. And in this book, she talks about how the feminist movement was recruiting a lot of very ideologically committed people, because those are the people who are willing to give their time to organizing, to mobilizing, to talking to people. But because these people were so ideologically committed, they were also had a lot of difficulty connecting with with people who disagreed with them and moderating their positions to try and get those people on their side. And this isn't to say that I mean, I know that this is a very complex thing for us to work through, because we don't want to surrender our values to try and get people to agree with us, and I don't think we should. But the point that I'm trying to make is that people are persuadable, and the platforms that Slacktivism facilitate Slacktivism are not the ones that we're going to persuade people on, and they are going to attract ideologically committed people who just can't really do that work on those platforms. But the flip side of this is I actually think that Gen Z has become acutely aware of this. This is not from academic work, but I have seen in a number of activist movements a keen awareness of this. So I know like the DSA has really focused on the need to have one-on-one organizing conversations, and the labor movement has long known this, but has really stepped up their game on that kind of organizing as well. And I think lots of activists around the country are aware of this and are spreading this gospel. So I don't want to sell Gen Z short. I think they are capable of moving beyond these platforms, and I think the frustration that I might feel for them is that what the millennials and boomers and so on are seeing are the things going on Twitter, and are like complaining about Gen Z activists who are just ranting on Twitter, and they're not paying attention to the really incredible organizing that a lot of them have done that gave birth to the George Floyd uprisings, that gave birth to the Sunrise movement, the environmental movement, and of course the gun rights or gun
The fight for our lives.
The fight for our lives. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I do occasionally miss the odd word here or there.
No, there's so many.
The fight for our lives. So these I've seen in a lot of these movements real organizing far beyond the things that happen on Slacktivism, or that are quote unquote Slacktivism.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That
that
was
a
great
bit of a
answer.
rambling answer.
No, I really enjoyed it, and I learned a lot from like your recommendations and your like academic points, but also your non-academic points. Another question I had was sort of touching on that, and you might speak a lot more to this because it sort of is your specialty, but how do you think Gen Z can improve their organizing efforts to advocate for certain causes or groups, or like political movements as well? Like,
I think the hardest thing, this isn't just for Gen Z, this is for activism and organizing in general, is really using these combustive moments to build the types of organizations that can continue to advocate after those moments are over. So like over the last 4.5 years have been a whirlwind, right? We've seen the birth of the Me Too movement, with the fight for our lives. There's the organizing around environmental justice, the rebirth of the labor movement, and of course the George Floyd uprisings. We've seen some of the largest protests in American history, right? Now you can almost, in certain spaces, you could feel like those things never happened. This isn't all spaces. I mean, I'm in academia, and like how we're incorporating DEI and sexual harassment prevention and justice like into the academy is something that a lot of people are still putting a lot of energy in, but in some spaces, like it could almost feel like it never happened. And the thing, and there are a lot of people who I saw posting these really powerful statements on Facebook, and this is where we get back to that Slacktivism. They're really you could call it virtue signaling, but I really think that these people cared. Like people genuinely care when their attention is focused on an issue and they recognize that they care. But they also have lives. They have mortgages and financial like making sure they can pay their bills, and their relationships and their friendships, and it's been a long year with COVID and I need a vacation. Like all of these things kind of like come back, and then suddenly all the energy they had for racial justice just kind of goes. And the thing that activists and organizers need to do is figure out ways during those moments where that person was focused on your issue, was focused on the thing that you care about, get them to become entangled in it, so that they can't, when those distractions happen, they can't get pulled back away. They're part of a meeting, or they have a reading group, or they're part of something, some social pressure that keeps them tied to the issue, so that the next time you can get pressure that big, you can get it even bigger. Or like there's a constituency that now elected officials know these people are voting on this issue and they are organizing on this issue. And if I want to win, this is an issue I need to pander to, right? And funders are like, oh, we need to direct resources towards this issue because there's this organization who has a huge capacity and has all this, is drawing all this attention, is reaching out and working their networks and so on. And that's hard, and it's really hard, and it requires creating organizations, which creates bureaucracies, which bureaucracies then create like their own problems, and it's a constant work. But it is possible. It's what makes change, and it's what I see. I should also say what I see a lot of activists and organizers doing. I'm from Georgia, and it was the constant work of activists and organizers who built organizations, didn't just focus on the moments, but focused on the long game, who turned that state blue. And I'm impressed and with what they've managed to do, right?
Very impressive. Yeah, I completely agree. And it sort of touches onto a question I had since the beginning, because you mentioned that Gen Z, or like for the 2020 election, they were like some percentage points higher to vote compared to like 2016 or in previous elections. So do you think this activism that is so important to Gen Z will continue even after they exit like their teens and 20s and enter like their 30s and 40s? Because I think one perception I have is that when you're young, you have so much more free time than once you have a job and a family and so on. So do you think it will continue on, and that activism, like that strength that they have in activism, will continue?
I think the kind of activism will change. So there's research that shows that youth are particularly drawn to out of system activism. So things like protest and rallies and while as you age, you tend to get drawn and become tied into more within system activism. So going to city council meetings or voting is the big one. That will probably happen, that shift, just as tends to happen. I will say that, so youth engage at a lower rate than the rest of the population, and basically over life people tend to ratchet up their engagement in politics. So while people do lose time, and so their participation in certain types of politics change, they don't fall off the wagon or on the wagon. And what we also know is that voting and other forms of political participation are habit forming. So there's this really interesting study which found that so if you're living with your parents, you're more likely, when you're 18, you're more likely to vote than if you're living away at college, just because like your parents are more likely to tell you to go vote. But what's really interesting is then 4 years later in the next election, you're more likely to have voted if you voted in that previous one. The exact mechanisms of why that happens, whether people are more politically interested or whether they understand how to do it, or they just like, it is unclear. But there are, like, political engagement is sticky. And while I definitely don't expect the types of protests that Gen Z has been leading over the last several years to continue on under their guard, I also expect those to continue, because I mean, I'm a millennial. I was there at Occupy. Like, we had our own youth protest moment, and we kind of faded a little bit, but we also are part of the organizations that helped Gen Z and other and also I should say, for all the mockery that boomers get, the resistance was very much driven, in states like Pennsylvania, was very much driven by middle-aged women, right? So this isn't And these are people who, a lot of people who had never engaged in politics before. So there is this dance that goes between what people have done in the past, what their interests are, what the crisis is, and how it touches on their lives, and the networks they're in that shape what people are doing. And I'm very hopeful that the increased engagement that we've seen over the last 4 years is going to be sticky.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's great. I hope that is the case. Yeah, I think these past few, like 4 or 5 years, I have definitely opened my eyes more to the different causes that Gen Z has advocated for. Maybe because I've gotten older, maybe because it's just been at the forefront our minds, like you said before. But yeah, so thank you so much for being willing to talk to me today and giving such insightful answers. I really learned a lot, and I hope the people watching will also have learned a lot. So thank you so much, Gabriel.
Well, thank you. This has been a pleasure. I wish you all the luck with this project, and I'm excited to see what comes of it.
All right, thank you. All right, well, thank you again so much for being willing to talk to us about the topic of Gen Z and activism. To start off, could you both introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about who you are and what you do? Maybe Laura, you can go first.
Sure. I'm Lori Rice. I'm a professor of political science at Southern Illinois University at Edwardsville, and I study political communication in a variety of forms, and one of those forms involves activism of young adults.
And I'm Ken Moffitt, and also a fellow professor of political science at SIU Edwardsville. And my research interests lie in American politics, and one of those areas is also activism among young adults.
All right, and you both wrote the book on, I'll pull up the title right here, The Political Voices of Generation Z. And so you are both the experts on this topic of Gen Z and activism and what that entails in the 21st century, I guess. So my first question for both of you is, do you think there is a difference between Gen Z and other generations in regards to activism? I know myself being a member of Gen Z, it is very important to like my friends and my like fellow students at my college. And so I wanted to know if you guys think that this is new for Gen Z or if this has been present in previous generations as well.
Sure. So it's certainly something that we're seeing at higher levels than we have in the previous few generations. So the levels of activism that we see among Gen Z right now rival that and perhaps even exceed that of what we saw for the baby boomers. So Gen Z, which I'm a part of at the tail end, we looked at the problems facing society, but the dominant response among Gen X was just to kind of throw up our hands and be discouraged. Where millennials would look at the problems of society, and the dominant response might be to try to do something but not go through a political route. Whereas Gen Z sees the problems in society and says, I want to make a difference.
Yeah, and also to build upon Lori's answer, that we do see a lot of survey evidence and a lot of academic evidence that does indicate that Gen Z is much more politically active than, say, their immediate preceding generations, like, say, for example, millennials or, for example, Gen X. And Stella Rouse and Ashley Ross wrote a great book that came out in 2018, which really walks through some of the ways in which Gen Z and millennials differ very much from some of their elders in many respects.
And do you think this increased interest in actively going towards the political institutions and like the elected leaders, do you think the internet and social media has anything to do with that? Or do you think it's sort of a different reason for it?
And I would say, yes, absolutely. The internet and social media is very much a fundamental part of this story. And so in our book, one of the things that we find very consistently is that posting about a wide array of issues at varying frequencies is connected with higher levels of civic activity. And it's also connected with higher levels of contacting elected government officials as well. And we found this not only in the book, but we've also found, say, for example, the seemingly trivial activities on, say, Snapchat or TikTok are also connected with higher levels of civic activity as well. So for example, like say sharing pictures, sharing videos, things like that. And so there is in our research for about a decade or so of analyzing survey data, we found this come up pretty much over and over and over again with varying data sets and varying surveys across time. So I'd say this is definitely part of the story here.
Yeah, and one of the things that we're seeing with Gen Z is whereas previous generations might have looked at a problem and say, I want to do something, but I'm not quite sure what to do. Gen Z isn't stopped by that. So Gen Z instead might pull out their phone and say, okay, well, let me look at what could I do to make a difference. And so I remember stories of members of Gen Z last summer as Black Lives Matter protests were beginning to happen. I don't know how to stage a protest, but let me Google it and see. And then taking that and turning it into a large community protest.
Yeah, I think being raised by the internet in multiple ways definitely makes them more flexible and more tuned in to how the internet and social media can help. And coming back to social media, there's this term Slacktivism. Do you think that makes a part in Gen Z's experience in interacting with activism? Do you think that many members of Gen Z will post a picture but then not follow up in taking action? It seems that consistently, it seems that they do take action, but do you think that also the lack of action after just posting a picture or showing solidarity, that they don't take action afterwards? Do you think that's also something that's present?
Well, there still might be slacktivism among some young adults, but we see much less of that slacktivism than there was among millennials. So Gen Z, if you post something on social media, right, then you're publicly committed to that position, and there's some pressure then both internally and externally to live up to that. You might get people commenting about, well, are you going to attend this protest? Or have you contacted this member of Congress about something? So we do see a link in our research between posting on social media and taking other forms of offline action.
Yeah, and to build upon what Lori has talked about, while slacktivism may be a thing for some, it is definitely not a thing for Generation Z. And that one of the things that we saw was that posting about all sorts of issues, anything from Supreme Court nominations, which normally don't generate that much of a public reaction that is sustained in any way. We found, say, for example, posting about Brett Kavanaugh, posting about Amy Coney Barrett. And what happened was that you had higher levels of civic activity. Also posting about, say, the Me Too movement at around its height in 2018 was also connected with higher levels of civic engagement thereafter in 2018. And the list goes on. And apart from the book, when we look at, say, for example, activities on Snapchat or activities on Facebook or in other forms of social media, and that connection with higher levels of civic engagement, and this is after we account for all the other explanations that we can account for, and we use some fairly high-level statistical techniques to account for those. Even after you account for all the other predispositions that we could account for to participate, we still find this link between online activities and offline civic engagement. We change up the data sets, we still find the same answer.
Yeah, I think social media has really been a large part of Gen Z, and maybe because of that continual connection and access. It's not so much as a tool, but more of a way to communicate and to express themselves. So they don't really see it as separate from their own actions and identity. A bit off the current path that we're on, but what do you think is some of the hardest challenges that Gen Z faces in their activism and actively making change and the issues that they see present in the world? Do you think that some elected officials or institutions don't see them as legitimate or not have that credibility that maybe previous generations had? Or is there something else that they confront that might hinder their ability to make change in the world?
And so I would say one thing that Gen Z continues to face a challenge on is having high voting rates relative to their elders. And so voting rates among Gen Z have improved and are higher than, say, for their elders at the same stage politically. Mm-hmm. But what's also happened is that voting rates have gone up among those among those older generations, if you will. And so one of the things about, say, political processes is that politicians pay attention to those who vote. Mm-hmm. And so that I would say that's one challenge. A second challenge, and you touched on this a little bit, that it's hard to translate, say, for example, say posting about something or participating in protests and then getting elected officials to act on that same thing. And the way that plays out, for example, is that sometimes action does lead to legal changes. Like, say, for example, related to the Me Too movement, you saw higher numbers of bills being introduced related to those policy areas that are directly implicated by the Me Too movement. Or say with gun control, what you saw afterward was that you had some states enact stricter gun control measures than what they otherwise would have. And also say with Black Lives Matter, is that you saw state level changes in public policies here in Illinois, some really significant ones that may or may not have occurred otherwise.
And to follow up on a few things that Ken said, Gen Z is voting at higher rates, like you said, than millennials did at the same age. But because we've seen several generations where young people voted at the lowest rates, what most politicians are still thinking of is that, oh, young people don't vote. And so Gen Z's voting rates went up, but some politicians might be thinking to themselves, well, that was a fluke, that was a one-off. And so it might take them a while to begin to see Gen Z as a powerful voting bloc. And then I think that the other challenge is policy change is often slow and it's easy to get discouraged. And so maintaining that momentum and maintaining that belief that, yes, change is possible and it's worth continuing to work for will be a challenge for Generation Z.
Yeah, that's another question I had for both of you is, do you think Gen Z's interest in activism, the strong presence that they have in different social movements, will continue as they grow older, as they exit their teens and 20s and into their 30s and 40s? Will they continue to have higher voting rates than previous generations at those same ages? Will they continue to show an interest in protests and advocating for different social movements?
And I can say I think so, because participation rates at younger years are highly correlated with participation rates later on down the line. And so if there are higher participation rates to start with, then those participatory patterns, if you will carry and expand out throughout their lives.
Yeah, it would be highly unusual if a generation that's so active were to suddenly withdraw from public life. So I agree. I think Gen Z will continue to be a politically active generation. But I think policy successes provide important momentum to keep going. And so I think it's important for Gen Z to see some areas where they're making a difference. And if they do, that will propel activism in other areas in the future.
Yeah, so you think it's unlikely that they will be discouraged so easily as maybe previous generations might have?
Yeah, go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, I think that's right. Because Gen Z has seen some policy successes. Granted, a lot of those policy successes haven't necessarily been at the national level, but they have been much more at the state and local levels. And one of the things that we as political science faculty tell our students is that oftentimes a lot of people like to focus on the national level and what happens on the national level. However, what happens at state and local levels oftentimes more directly affects people on a day-to-day basis than what happens at the national level. Take, for example, say conversations about policing. Most police agencies don't exist at the national level in the US. They exist at state and local levels. So that state and local level change has a very significant impact on a whole lot of people and in ways that many may not necessarily readily think about.
And if we think about the example of March for Our Lives, well, the movement hasn't necessarily seen significant success at national level change. They were responsible in some pretty significant reforms with respect to gun laws in Florida. So those state level victories are important, and I think they will help encourage those who are active in various movements to believe that they can make a difference and to turn their efforts to other issues while they continue to work on the same ones that first drew them to activism.
And do you think Gen Z has been able to connect more with their local communities or their state and local governments, and then pay more attention to those issues than previous generations that might have tended to focus more on the national level? And if so, why do you think that is?
And I think part of it is because politicians at local levels have to be much more responsive to electorates than, say, those necessarily at national levels. Because at the local level, the electorates tend to be much smaller, and also frequently with respect to local level officials, some of them do have shorter terms of office. And so there is a responsiveness mechanism that doesn't necessarily hold in the same sorts of ways at the national level. But I think also there's another thing that goes on here, and that is the way a lot of these movements are organized. And so Black Lives Matter would be a really good example of this, where yes, you have the National Black Lives Matter organization, but a lot of the activities happen at the state level, happen at the local level. And not just through these state and local level Black Lives Matter organizations, but through other affiliated organizations as well. And you see a somewhat similar pattern with respect to gun control, as well as other issues too.
Well, I guess one last question for both of you is, it seems like Gen Z is doing a good job in creating a lot of momentum and impacting change. But do you think there is anything that Gen Z should learn from previous generations that maybe they haven't done before, or like Gen Z hasn't done, that they can learn from previous generations?
That's a very good question. And I think there are some things that they probably could learn from other generations. So one perhaps obvious one would be thinking back to the greatest generation. They voted at really high rates. Were Gen Z to start voting at those levels, politicians would have no choice but to listen to the concerns of Gen Z. So I think that's one clear lesson that Gen Z could take from a prior generation.
And to add another, I would think also, like say for example, with posting or participating in protests, a lot of those are usually seen in terms of interest groups in politics as more outsider tactics. However, at the same time, if you think about the way that policy gets made, policy often gets made through a lot of insider tactics. And so in part, a transition could be, say, donating to candidates for office. Because another thing about politicians is that they also listen to donors, and they're also responsive to donors. Now, does that mean that donors buy politicians, so to speak? We don't find much evidence of that nationally, but at the same time, there is a link with respect to responsiveness. And so that's one thing. The second thing is contact government officials, run for office, because those are the next steps, so to speak.
Yeah, do you, jumping off of your last point, do you think that Gen Z will be more disposed or more interested in running for office and taking up those more insider roles in government in all sorts of like local, state, and national levels?
I think it's a little bit too early to tell, but it is a way that Gen Z could really make a difference. And we saw several generations where people were hesitant to run for office. It was one of the last things that they had ambition to do. But if Gen Z isn't being listened to, a good way to make sure that you get listened to is to get yourself elected to office where people have to listen.
All right, well, thank you both so much for agreeing to talk to me today. I really learned a lot, and I hope the people that are viewing this video also learned a lot from the both of you. So thank you again for being willing to be interviewed by me and for sharing your insights on this matter.
Yeah, and thank you, and we were happy to do so.